Let me get started. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for this seminar with the Economic Diplomacy Initiative, which seeks to eliminate issues and policy choices at the intersection of economic and foreign policy. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Yan Xuetong. My name is Aditi Kumar, and I'm the Executive Director of the Belfer Center, where I also lead this initiative along with Nick Burns and Larry Summers. This semester, we will be debating the issues that will be at the top of the next administration's agenda. These include the global competition for digital dominance. For those of you interested in tech and digital issues, in addition to today's discussion, we're hosting next week Roland Cloutier, the Chief Information Security Officer at TikTok. So please do sign up for this session. That's on Thursday at 4 p.m. Just as another reminder, please do mute yourselves, but we invite you to keep your video on. We're going to save the second half of this session for audience questions, when you can either raise your hands to ask directly or chat us your questions. And this event is being recorded, and we do plan to share it on our social media and on the Belfer website. And so just so you're aware if your video is on and if you ask a question, we are recording it. Let me first introduce my co-moderator for this event, Christopher Lee. Chris is a research fellow with the Economic Diplomacy Initiative, where he focuses on U.S. China relations, Asia Pacific security, and biotechnology. He was previously research assistant to Graham Allison, and he's currently pursuing his master's at Tsinghua University as a Schwarzman Scholar. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Yan Xuetong. Professor Yan is Distinguished Professor at Tsinghua University and former Dean of the Institute of Modern International Relations at Tsinghua. In addition, he's Secretary General of the World Peace Forum, an annual global affairs conference in Beijing, and President of the Carnegie Tsinghua Management Board. Professor Yan is known to many as China's top foreign policy scholar, specializing in U.S. China relations and national security. He's a prolific author of many books, including most recently, Leadership and the Rise of Great Powers. Professor Yan is no stranger to Belfer and has given talks at Harvard several times over the past few years. Professor Yan, we wish we could have welcomed you in person, but we're delighted to have you with us on Zoom to present on this topic of U.S. China bipolar rivalry in the digital age. Professor Yan, let me now turn it over to you for your opening remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, Eddie, and for your very nice introduction about me. Well, actually, I just published the article about the bipolar rivalry between China and the US in the digital age. And actually, I found that this article has not caused very much attention. And there's not very much debate or discussion about how different the China-US competition and will be from the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US. So today I will give you a 10 minutes introduction about this article and also about my main concern about the future of China and the US relations. And recently, and you may find that Cold War or New Cold War is a very, very popular used in medias. And it seems to me and many journalists and some academic scholars and like the term very much. They use a New Cold War to describe the current competition between China and the US. And so the question to me is that why those people and think the competition between China and the US are same like that what we experienced during the Cold War. And actually, I after a second thought, I found that and possibly people have different definitions about the Cold War. For instance, and when people use the term Cold War, and they seem to me, they use it to describe a kind of great power competition, different from the World War I and World War II. But then the question is that why no one to describe the period between the two major wars, and that more than 2 decades as Cold War. Why only after the World War II people concerned we had a Cold War rather than between the two world wars? The reason is very simple, and because everyone knows that, and the Cold War is used the term to describe the a special type of war. So Cold War is a war. It doesn't mean it's a peace. And the Cold War, during the period of Cold War, is full of wars, full of hard wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the 6 wars in Middle East, the war between the Pakistan and the Indian, and until even the war between Iraq and the Iran, and until the very, very late year of the period of the Cold War, and then we have the Gulf War. So you see, Cold War means war. It doesn't mean peace. It also doesn't mean that half peace, half war. So now I want to come to talking about my article. Is that based on this thinking, I'm look at the difference between the China-U.S. competition and with that between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the most fundamental difference between between these two great power competition is that the core of the competition is different, or the engine behind the competition are different. And also related is the strategy adopted by the two sides are different from those we are familiar during Cold War. And first, we found that in the digital age, the national wealth of major powers mainly come from or generated from the digital economy. And meanwhile, the national security is also heavily focused on the cyber security rather than the other things. So that's why, and the proxy war becomes outdated by the digital technology. That means going to a proxy war cannot help any sides to achieve technology superiority or the digital superiority. Actually, digital superiority is what China and the US compete for, right? So then the question is why during this period the people becomes less interested in ideology than during the Cold War? Because during the Cold War, the important engine behind the competition between US and the Soviet Union is the ideological confrontation. And both of them try to expand their ideology all over the world, communism and the liberalism or capitalist liberalism. And so for the sake of the expanding their own ideology, they need what? They need to use a proxy war to help those political groups who prefer, adopt, or follow their ideological model. So that's why, and they support the opposite parties and in the third country to fight against each other for the regime power. So if anyone have a control that's the third country's government, and mainly by help those politicians and hold the same ideology with them. So the ideology is the engine of the Cold War. And the ideological expansion is the goal of the competition between US and Soviet Union. But today, it's different. The first, and I don't think any side expanding its ideology will get international, will influence, increase its international influence. The reason is very simple, because nowadays most of the country have to move into the digital age. their national wealth, their national security heavily rest on the digital technology. So these countries will make the decision and which side, which technology they will use. Americans digital technology or Chinese digital technology. So which one is cheaper and which one is safer and which one is more advanced than the other side. So these changed. The criterion for make foreign policy change, and foreign policy is no longer based on ideology, but based on utility of the digital technology. The second important thing for the difference between China-US rivalry and that between US and the Soviet Union is the mentality. And during the Cold War, the geopolitical mentality is has a very, very strong impact on policymakers. And both the policymakers in Moscow and Washington believe that, and if they control the natural resources of the world or control the strategic routes, and then they can win the competition. So both sides and physically compete for controlling natural resources and a strategic road and in the other countries. But today, then you find that the country control because the national wealth and mainly generated from the digital economy, natural resources can no longer have that kind of importance to the major powers. That means you can control all of the oil in Middle East. It doesn't mean make the country strong. And the Middle East have a lot of the oil, but none of them are modernized and like the industrialized countries. So nowadays the economy heavily rests on technology invention rather than control the natural resources of the world. Second, it's about the security. And during that period, during the Cold War, and the superpowers provide security by sending troops to that country, have a military base, or even they said, okay, they make an alliance with each other and to guarantee the security protection and military protection. But today, the security protection is not based on the troops and the military base, or even not the naval force, and based on the cyber protection. That means how much the superpowers can provide cyber security for its allies. So you see, both wealth and the security and heavily rest on these the digital capability or digital technology. Then these countries will make the political judgment or according to their digital needs rather than their ideological relations and or similarities or with one of the superpowers. And the final point is that I still come to the very beginning argument. And when people talking about the new Cold War, seems to me they ignore that the Cold War is not a general sense for describing a kind of a major powers competition. It is a term for a specific historical period. I think those people have any knowledge about Chinese history. You all know that we have two important historical periods, and the spring and the autumn, and warring states. These two historical periods connected with each other and continued. And then among these two periods, the major powers compete for dominance in the ancient Chinese territory. But then the question is that why the historians believe there's two historical periods never used and new autumn and spring and autumn to describe the period and the warring state, which is immediately behind the period of the spring and autumn. Because the first period, the rule or the norms and the govern the major powers of competition is compete for dominance, for hegemony. The second come to the period of the warring states, and the major powers compete for annexing other countries' territory. So you see, this makes so I mean that the Cold War, the term, actually is used to describe a very specific historical period. Maybe it is the term used for that period forever, never used to describe the any major powers in human history in the future. And so finally, I will say that. And why would I want to make the distinction between the Cold War and the non-Cold War competition between China and the US? And the reason is that in the digital age, the competition between China and the US will be very, very new to us. And if we do not know the difference between these two periods, I mean the Cold War and today, and then both sides will adopt a wrong strategy, and both sides will go to what? Go to the proxy war. And I don't think that they make any side, that the proxy war will be in favor of any side. They just make the disaster to the world, but not benefit their own superiority or the competition. So I think I stop here, and is prepared to hear others' remarks and comments.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Yan, for your presentation. We have a lot of distinguished members in the audience on today's call. I see former ambassador to China, Ambassador Roy, see Professor Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School. Unfortunately, too many to acknowledge, but I'd like to start off by recognizing two members of the Belfer Center's China Working Group and faculty at Harvard who we're honored to have with us today. First, Professor Ezra Vogel, who's one of the leading scholars of China. He previously served as National Intelligence Officer for Asia in the Clinton administration and wrote an enormously influential book on Deng Xiaoping. And also Professor Michael Soni, one of Harvard's other leading sinologists and historians of late imperial China. And Professor Soni most recently served as director of the Fairbanks Center for China Studies at Harvard. So Professor Vogel, would you like to respond, ask a question, make a comment? You're on mute.
You need to unmute, Ezra.
I want to say how fortunate we are at this time of difficulty between China and the United States to carry on such a frank discussion. To have Yan Xuetong has always been very frank and very honest and very knowledgeable, address us, and to have such distinguished people as Ambassador Roy and Mike Soni and many others in the audience. I have two comments I would like to add to the differences between the Cold War and today. First of all, China is so complicated and so enmeshed in the world in a way that Russia was not. Yan Xuetong got a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. We have so many, over 360,000 Chinese before coronavirus were studying in the United States, and we have such a deep intermixture and interrelationship. Secondly, the power of China has not been primarily military, it's been economic power. One of the reasons it's so lost out is because they spent too much in the military and became bankrupt. But China is an economic power and is continuing to grow. My question to Xuetong is, what does China want? After it passes the United States economically, which is likely in the next decade, what does China aim to do with its great power?
Do I respond to that?
Please.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Professor Vogel, and you gave me a very good question. And actually, first, I think it's a long time to discuss about China becomes richer than the United States. And personally, I would predict that within 20 years, and China cannot possess the exactly same national comprehensive power and as the United States. Maybe China's GDP is larger than the US, but it doesn't mean China is richer than the US, taking into accounting the population, the size of population. Second, and even China has a larger GDP than the US, and China's military capability and the technology capability of technology invention still cannot be that competitive like US. So at least within 20 years, I don't think China will surpass US comprehensive. Second, and after if China and surpass US have a larger resources or the mature capability than the US, what will China to do? And according to my personal theory, that depends on the leadership. That depends on what kind of leadership we have in that period. In 20 years, we maybe have a leader who really prefer so-called Wang Dao, the human authority, and emphasize the Wang Dao. But then maybe we have the Ba Dao leadership, the hegemonic leadership. So what kind of the goal of the strategy of China in that period purely depends on the leadership. And also, I would relate it to this is that my understanding, the current competition between China and the US is at the governmental level. It's a state-to-state competition. It's not a competition between the people. Like you said that there's many American educated PhD in China. I don't think these people hold hostile attitudes toward the US people. And also you can imagine there are so many Chinese students still studying in the US, and some are there has jobs there and or immigrant to the US. So I think that even today, the national competition becomes intensified, but the people-to-people relationship for me is still the same. I cannot see there's any change and in the people-to-people relationship between China and the US.
Right, thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor to audience questions. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function and I'll call on you. Just a few ground rules. We'd appreciate it if you just briefly introduce yourself. Please ask one question. We have a lot of people in the audience, and please ensure that your question is actually a question. It ends with a question mark. I see first Ambassador Stapleton Roy.
Professor Yan, that was a very, very helpful presentation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Professor Yan's book about the warring state and spring and autumn period and the strategic thinking that emerged from the competition among the smaller states that later formed the China. It's very interesting. I agree with your basic point that treating the present time as a new Cold War is a false analogy. I think I worked on the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and I see enormous differences during the Cold War. In our relations with the Soviet Union, we were largely focused on avoiding nuclear war and on trying to limit our strategic competition. And that was the focus of what we were trying to do. At the present time, the real issue in the competition is that the countries surrounding China are not controlled by China. but they have enormous mutual interests with China. And the United States has enormous mutual interests with the countries surrounding China.
Yeah.
The Eastern European countries during the Cold War had no choice, as we saw from the Soviet interventions in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. But the countries in East Asia do have a choice. So in some ways, the competition is going to be driven by the ability of China and the United States to more or less successfully link our interests to the interests of the countries in East Asia. And that's an area where neither of us are doing as well as we should be doing. And my question to you, Professor Yan, is, at the moment, China is doing what it said it wouldn't do. It's behaving like a typical rising power and is acting assertively to use its new power to try to coerce countries to take positions that are compatible with China's interests. So we have the wolf warrior diplomacy that we're seeing. The United States is making similar mistakes for different reasons. But my question to you is, there seems to be a connection between domestic developments in China and this impulse that forces Chinese diplomats to behave in ways that make them look like wolf warriors. And my question is that a temporary phase? Or do you think, because it's damaging China, polls show that it's damaging China's foreign policy? And my question is China's foreign policy likely to change in the near future in ways that would make it more easy for the United States to find common interests with China?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Ambassador Roy's question is very crucial to the future of China-US relations, because now people in the US and China discussing about how to avoid the Cold War. That means we concern there's a kind of a danger of the Cold War. So like I just argued, and as long as we avoid ideological confrontation, and we will have a rivalry between the two countries, but it's not, which is not Cold War. So here, the question, my answer to you, the final question, and what China's foreign policy and going to adjust it, to be adjusted. My understanding, China already adjusted its foreign policy, and from the July. And on July 7th, and Le Yicheng, the deputy foreign minister, and first and discussed, talking about, and did not want to have an ideological confrontation with the United States, and then followed by Wang Yi, and then followed by Yang Jiechi, and then followed by Song Tao, the minister of the party liaison. Finally, and when our national leader have the meeting with the UN Secretary General Guterres, and I think at the 75th the UN conference, and said that, and China never fight ideological confrontation with others. So my understanding, this is a fundamental change, or at least the most important adjustment of a foreign policy, and after the 19th Party Congress. And so you see, I think the reason for the Chinese government repeatedly to tell the world, we do not want to go to ideological confrontation against the US, because they realize that ideological confrontation will inevitably bring about another Cold War. So if we do not want, we know that Trump and his people will purposely to fend up and the ideological confrontation with China, and they even publicly said that they want to have a new Cold War. So for China, and my understanding that usually there's a wrong mentality, and in China, you know, and I advocate the making alliance, but many people, including the policymakers, said, Yan Xuetong, you're wrong. And because if we make an alliance, we will bring about a new Cold War. But now people realize that making alliance cannot bring about a Cold War. Have an ideological confrontation will bring about a new Cold War. So that's the I think this new phenomenon started from the July, and it's very important. And the second thing about the China and becomes more assertive than before and dealing with neighbors. Well, I think China's foreign policy it is and it becomes more assertive than before. But then meanwhile, you find that our surrounding countries adopt a policy different from what they did during the Cold War. Our surrounding countries adopt a strategy of a hiding, or the hiding strategy. And they do not want to make an alliance between with either China or the US. So this is also a very important signal. And I think important the criteria and to illustrate this is not Cold War. And the surrounding countries become reluctant. They're forced to take sides between China and the US, and then they take the sides with both sides on different issues. And it's initiated by Singapore, and stand with China on economy and stand on with the US on the security issues. So I mean that when China becomes, when people said that China becomes assertive to neighbors, well, I think China becomes assertive to some neighbors, not everyone. For instance, China get along with Russia, China get along with South Korea, and try to get along with Mongolia, with all of this Turkestan, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan, and certainly we have a quite close relationship with Pakistan, and we only have a relationship and being bilateral relationship deteriorated with India and I think Australia, but Australia is not a neighbor. And maybe a little bit with Vietnam. So if you're concerned, except these two countries, and even our relationship with Japan in getting improved in the late period of the Abe. So my understanding, China's foreign policy did becomes assertive, but only to some countries, not most of the surrounding countries.
Great. Next, I'd like to go to Ping Wang.
Hi, thank you, Belfer Center, for organizing this event. I'm very excited to see so many China experts here. So I'm a Chinese citizen living in the US for over 9 years now. My question is regarding Western's perception of China's rise. In my years living in the United States, I saw so many people anxious or like so much anxiety about China's rise, and they don't know what China really, really wants to do with its rising influence. And no matter how China explained its intention to the world, we don't want to be number one, but the message is not really captured by the West. So my question is to the professor, how do you think Chinese government should do to ease the anxiety of the Western countries about China's rise? I think this is a very important question.
Okay. I do agree with you. This is a very important issue, but actually, the Americans, people's anxious about China's rise is normal. It's not unique, and the U.S. once anxious about the rise of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. once anxious about the rise of the Japan in 1980s. So all of these hegemon powers, they're anxious about any country to catch up with it. So the people, I mean, the Americans want to maintain their leading power, leading position in the world. That's understandable. And also the anxious about losing their leading position is also understandable. So question is that from my understanding, there's no way. It's no way for China to make America feel at peace and to accept China's rise peacefully. That is impossible. But why I think it's still very crucial, important, is that China should concern how to prevent this kind of anxiousness and escalating into hatred, and how to prevent this anxiousness and become escalation of the confrontation into a war. So as long as China and the US can maintain a peaceful competition and between them, I think that will be good enough, because that will tell the world, look at that, finally we have a competition between two major powers and peacefully carried out. And it's much better than what we experienced in the human history.
Next, can we go to Professor Michael Soni, Director of the Fairbanks Center. Professor Soni.
Hi, Professor. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here. I'm unmuted, I hope.
Yeah.
Great.
Sure.
Let me first of all just make a so thank you. I always learn from your comments, and I can already see how your wonderful analogy of why there isn't a new Chunqiu period. I'm going to be teaching with that idea. I'm going to steal that idea right away. Let me start by just echoing a comment that Ezra made, both in your prepared remarks and in Ezra's response. It was pointed out that one of the ways in which the Cold War analogy fails utterly is by the close intertwining of our two societies, and Ezra cited the example of education. And I just want to make a very quick comment that this intertwining, the mutual engagement of Chinese students at Harvard and at other American universities and vice versa, has been enormously to our benefit. It's been to my benefit, it's been to your benefit, it's been to the benefit of everyone on this call. And I think we really need to in this moment of deteriorating and declining relations, we in the universities need to speak out loud and clear. There will have to be new restrictions on technological exchange, clearly, but we do need to have our voices be heard. Sorry, that was my soapbox for just one moment. Let me now ask you two very quick questions. In your comments, you pointed out that one of the problems with the Cold War term is that, of course, the Cold War wasn't cold. It was cold between the principals and hot everywhere else. There was violent conflict everywhere else. Yes. So my first question is, in this new phase of bipolar confrontation, how do you think third parties will suffer? That is to say, in this new phase, what are going to be the ways in which the non-principals are going to get hurt? My second question has to do with the lessons of the Cold War. So we can critique the use, and I agree with you, we can critique the use of the Cold War as a term that goes beyond its historically specific period. But there's a second reason why we might want to think about the term, which is that it might have useful lessons for us in this current phase. So to come back to a point you made earlier, there was a very, very important book of Chinese strategy, the Zhanguoce, the Strategies of the Warring States. And Chinese strategic thinkers continued to use it even in periods that were not the new warring states. So the question is, even if we acknowledge that the Cold War is a false analogy to the present moment, what, if any, are the lessons that we can learn from that previous moment for geostrategic rivalry in the digital age?
Well, thank you, Michael, for the question. I think this question is also very new to me. I never think about what kind of lessons we should learn from the Cold War. Okay, I think I like the question very much because I never think about this issue. First, I think there's some positive things we should learn from the Cold War. And Firstly is the nuclear weapons. The nuclear strategy and the mutual deterrence maintain the global peace. This is very important. Why we use the term Cold War to describe that period? That means there's a hot wars everywhere, but there's no direct war between the major powers. There's no global war. So in that way, today the nuclear weapons still can play that function to prevent direct war between China and the US. I think this is a very positive thing. And the second, and we can learn from the Cold War, is that even for the two superpowers to compete for the global power, and they can cooperate on something. For instance, non-proliferation and treaty is a very typical cooperation between Soviet Union and the US. And during the Cold War, and the US and the Soviet Union even worked together to invent the vaccines to deal with the smallpox and some disease. So these things are positive. For today, I think China and the US should talk to each other to have a negative list, just like during the Cold War between Soviet Union and the US, consider, hey, what we should not do. Instead of talking about cooperation, and they should talking about how can we work together, prevent the nuclear war between us, prevent direct war between us, and even how to prevent proxy war between us. So I don't think China and the US need a positive they can develop a positive cooperation, but then negative cooperation or the preventative cooperation is very necessary. And that was possible during the Cold War. That's why it won't be possible for today. So now, if you ask me what I suggested for these two countries, I would suggest to develop a negative list of what they are not going to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to go to Disha Trivedi. Disha.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for being here. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm a graduate student in the MIT Technology and Policy program, where I focus on multinational biotechnology governance. My question actually builds upon a point that you mentioned in your response to Ambassador Roy about the bilateral relationship between India and China, especially considering perhaps the recent conflicts over the line of actual control between India and China, as well as perhaps India's shift from non-alignment to potential issue-based alignment. I was wondering what you saw of the role of India in perhaps altering the relationship between the US and China, as well as the sort of role of India in relationships between itself and China. I was wondering what potentially you think the role of India might be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think China's relationship with India is very, very special. And because the Indians' foreign policy and moving in the totally opposite direction from the other countries. For instance, just now I said that many countries adopted the hedging strategy and from making alliance. But the Indian just opposite, from making from a non-alignment, for example, to the hedging strategy, right? So they are moving toward the same strategy, but from different directions. So when China to look at the surrounding country, find, hey, the other countries become so more moderate and less hostile towards China, because usually many countries make alliance with the US, like a Philippines, take a very confronting policy towards China. But now they take a hedging strategy, and China say, hey, this country becomes moderate than before. And to Indian, just the opposite, because the Indian during the Cold War making no alliance and do not give such a strong support to the US policy against China. But today, suddenly, they shift from non-alignment principle to hedging strategy, and then they stand at the American side and on the security issues. That's why it makes the China-Indian relationship becomes difficult than before. That's my understanding.
Great. Next, I'd like to go to Andy Zelicki. Andy.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan, for your excellent comments. You mentioned nuclear deterrence as having successfully prevented direct conflict between the US and the Soviets in the original Cold War, and your hope that the same will deter and make impossible a direct conflict between the US and China. But there's a lot of growing concern about the possibility of a direct clash over Taiwan in particular. And I understand that this is a core issue of sovereignty from the Chinese perspective. But I'd like to ask you a direct question on this. Can you imagine a scenario, perhaps in the context of a broader settlement between the US and China, in which there would be an explicit, very public commitment made by the Chinese government never to use military force against Taiwan, except in a scenario where Taiwan perhaps had declared independence?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think this question is very sensitive politically and to China and the US. And actually, for a long time, from the Clinton's period, and both China and the US seem to me and agreed with each other on a principle and so guiding their policy toward Taiwan. They use the term ambiguity. So ambiguity and becomes a principle guiding the two sides of policy. The reason for them to prefer to ambiguity because they think the ambiguity leaves more room for them to manipulate the situation. But actually, if we record history from Clinton's period to now, you find that ambiguity sporadically brought about the conflicts between China and US over the Taiwan issue. So that's my view for years. I said that China and US should replace the principle of ambiguity with clarity. That means that both China and the US should have a clear policy toward Taiwan, make each side understand what's the right line of the other sides. And some people said, okay, you cannot expect that America adopt a clarified policy in favor of the China. That's true. But even unfavorable, for instance, and the US said that US will use the military force and to support Taiwan's independence. But then they must have some condition. For instance, and the US said, we will not use nuclear weapons to support Taiwan's independence. And they said, US can make decision of what kind of right line he wants. They want the US, because I don't think the US, okay, we will support Taiwan's independence at the cost of a nuclear war, right? They definitely won't. So no matter what the clarified policy is, it will make both sides knows that what this right line of setup by the other side, so should be cautious about that. Today, it's the opposite. Both sides think, hey, the ambiguity gave me a chance to take some policy aggressive and to test the other's right line. So because each side tries to test the other side's right line and make the situation and intensify. And when they know the right line, where are they? And they will become more cautious than before. Just like you at the beginning, you suggest if the mutual deterrence can maintain the relative strategic stability between the Soviet Union and the US, I think China and the US also need to concern, they may want to concern the mutual deterrence on Taiwan issue.
Great. For purposes of time, I'm going to go to two people to wrap up. So can we have Alex Hu and then James Moore? Please both ask your questions, and we'll have Professor Yan answer both at the same time.
Hi, well, thank you so much for this talk. I'm currently a research intern at the Hudson Institute, and my question is basically concerning certain ideological developments in China, notably people on the New Left like Yan Xuetong, who are writing about the future of history in kind of ideological terms. But of course, what they say is that this ideological competition should not be the way that we think about the competition between states. Do you see a potential for that to flip in the way that US thinking about history for a long time remained relatively isolationist, but then suddenly became a crusading sort of force?
Mm-hmm. Well, first we must say that the ideological confrontation is the only phenomenon for the Cold War. Before Cold War, we have many wars caused by religion confrontation, by the territory confrontation, by the resources confrontation, even by the river competition. But the ideological competition only happened during the Cold War, not the World War II, not World War I, right? So it's very possibly it's the last ideological confrontation in modern history. And from my understanding, there's no way to persuade the Trump administration to give up the idea to pick up and pick out ideological confrontation against China. But then China said, okay, just do it by yourself. I do not want to respond to it. And so I try to avoid this confrontation. I will compete with the US in technology, in economy, in the military, and in the education, and in many substantial fields. But then China said, I have no interest in the ideology confrontation with you. If you do it, just do it by yourself. So I think this strategy will work. Because any confronting, any war, you need two parties. You cannot have one party to have a confrontation, right?
Great, and then very quickly, James Moore.
Yes, thank you, Professor Yan, for being with us. My question revolves around when Henry Kissinger visited China, it seemed one of his main objectives, obviously, was to open relations between the two, but also build trust. And it seems like China and the US, neither side trusts the other one. China feels like the US is trying to contain its technological development and kind of undermine the Communist Party. And the US feels like China is also doing similar things to it. And so my question is, what do you think China could do that it's not currently doing that could engender some more trust on the US side? And at the same time, what do you think the US could do to build more trust with China going forward?
Okay, I think 2 points. First, and seems to me Kissinger very recently and suggests that China and the US need to reach some kind of agreement and to manage the competition. And he said that China and US need a competition rule to govern their competition. So this idea in some way like my argument, the negative list of what are not going to do. And second, I think, talking about the mutual trust, I don't think mutual trust is important for managing China-US relationship. I don't think the hegemon power will have any trust in the rising power, and also rising power have no any trust in the hegemonic power. The question is that the confrontation between China and the US is not because of the lack of the mutual trust. It's because of conflicting interests between them. So how can we avoid this conflicting interests, conflicts escalating the war? From my understanding, they need to consider how to enlarge the common interests or shared interests. So if they do not enlarge the base of the shared interests or the complementary interests, and there is no way to improve their mutual trust, because both sides only trust 2 things. One, they trust the interests. Second, they trust the capability. So as long as both sides have a larger common interests, and then they will trust each other.
Great, and then using, I guess, my moderator's prerogative, I'll ask the last question related to a topic that's of quite a significant degree of interest to our economic diplomacy initiative. So in your Bipolar Rivalry article from June, you argue that China's digital mentality will drive the country to increase cooperation in the digital realm with other countries as a foreign policy strategy. And in April, China's central bank actually introduced the digital yuan, becoming the first major economy to issue a national digital currency. So as China continues to refine its digital currency architecture, what actions do you expect China to take with regard to exporting this financial technology to other countries? And how do you see that affecting the bilateral relationship with the US?
Well, actually, in my article, I suggest or advocate the idea of a digital mentality. I don't think the Chinese government making foreign policy based on the digital mentality. And still, the geopolitical mentality have a strong impact on policy making in both Beijing and Washington. So at this moment, and personally, I encourage both Chinese and American policymakers to think about their strategy from the perspective of digital mentality rather than the geopolitical mentality. So what does it mean, digital mentality? Digital mentality means that heavily focus on the technology invention, heavily focus on the competition for technology superiority rather than to go to the war and or to use any other strategy to improve their capability. My personal prediction that the country will possess the digital superiority will win the competition. And so that actually the traditional strategy, I mean, so the geopolitical strategy cannot help neither China or US to improve their digital superiority. So nowadays you find that, and there's for instance, the one belt one road is a geopolitical concern. It's not a digital concern. And the US making the ideological alliance against China is also a geopolitical mentality rather than the digital mentality. So I would say that by this moment, it seems to me the digital mentality is not popular. Just that beginning. I wish and more policymakers gave concern to my arguments.
All right, well, unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour. So I'd like to thank Professor Yan Xuetong for taking time, especially I know it's late in the evening in Beijing, for speaking with all of us. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you for your attendance, especially from our distinguished guests. We encourage you to check out the Belfer Center website about the Economic Diplomacy Initiative, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night, or good evening, good morning.